We're all in this together. You're watching Social Distance Learning by ISBA. Get the kids together. Learn something new. Ask a few questions and engage.
Hey everybody, Shalom, peace and salam from the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona. Totally had a brain fart there for a second. Good morning, late afternoon to everyone today, coming from my house in the West Valley to you guys, and thanks for joining us for another episode of Social Distance Learning during the coronavirus pandemic. What we are offering from the ISBA is short segments of our regular curriculum brought to you in your homes so that you can continue to learn, engage, know your neighbor most importantly, and for those of you who are educators to direct your students to continue to come and earn their extra credit points by commenting and asking questions in the comment. They can also write, oh, I'm pointing to the wrong way. Whenever they see this attendance bar, I think they write their name, I believe. Or no, they type in HERE to help our educators out and take attendance. So keep those questions coming during and after my segment today is over. What we are bringing to you today is going to be from our regular curriculum, Women in Islam. Common stereotypes or breaking the stereotypes. Our material is, of course, copyrighted from the Islamic Network Group, which is based out in California. So as it stands, we are not the owners of this. We do use copyrighted material. So should you feel like you would like to take screenshots, then please know that that is copyrighted material that you cannot share. And we're happy to present it to you in bits and pieces. The Islamic Network Group has very standardized and very well reviewed presentations that they have reviewed by multiple Muslim scholars in the United States. So none of the information that I'm saying today is reflective of any kind of expertise I have outside of being a woman of Islam and a woman living Islam. So I am not a scholar by any means. Like the other certified speakers of the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, I am trained. We have a set curriculum where we have to learn these materials, get tested on it, and have continuing education to remain certified in order to bring these presentations to you in public, whether you're a house of worship, you're a Rotary Club, you're a church, youth group, whatever. We will come out and provide these for you in person usually, but right now this is how we're presenting it. And I'm super excited to talk about this particular subject, a little bit about my background for any of you who missed my Getting to Know American Muslims and Their Faith, the portion that I gave. I believe it was a week ago, 10 days ago. The little blurb that I gave was the five practices, no, the six beliefs of Muslims. And when I introduce myself, it really helps address some of the questions that typically come about women in Islam. My name is Uzma Jaffrey. I'm a mom of four. I'm a physician professionally. I do that when I have time outside of being a mom, and right now there's a lot of time. So I run my own practice. When I walk into a room or when I walk into a particular demographic and I give that information right there, breaks a whole heck of a lot of stereotypes, things that we still see on certain TV shows. So we're going to be addressing not those stereotypes, but kind of in answer to those stereotypes, what is the Quran and the Sunnah? Or the dirty word in the media is Sharia law. What does that actually say about women in Islam? And so we have a few examples of that from our presentations today, and we'll jump right in. We are ready for our first slide. So this is the outline of the entire presentation, Women in Islam, Breaking the Stereotypes by the Islamic Network Group. So we talk about stereotypes and where they're coming from. We talk about women in Islam today. How are they being educated? How are they in the workforce, both in the United States and abroad? We talk about leaders and innovators, and there's going to be a lot of popular names that you see on the news in there, in media in there. And then part four is kind of where we'll be hanging out today, rights of women in the Quran and in the Sunnah, or again, the dirty word in the media is Sharia law. Part five talks about gender relations and modest dress. We don't get a whole lot of questions on the headscarf, incidentally, the hijab, but that's kind of where that ends up, and that's a whole section. And probably we could talk about that for at length if we really, really wanted to. And then women in Islamic history and their basic contributions to modern civilization as we know it. If anybody has gone to a university, they should look that up. And then examining challenging issues faced by American Muslim women in particular today. So we'll go to the next slide. And very quickly, common stereotypes about Muslim women and what they are. So typically, what I'm shattering when I walk into a room is that women are oppressed, submissive, they have few rights, are all veiled, and they're all uneducated. So I can't tell you the number of times that I have gone through customs, and it probably won't happen again soon, but where, my husband's just holding all the passports because I'm holding the kids and other things, and he will turn in the passports, and the officer at customs will be asking him, can she do this, can she stand here for the picture, can she, and he's like, you can ask her. It is very common for people who look like me to have somebody speaking English very loudly in our faces. So when we walk in and we say, well, first of all, I drove myself here. There's no dude with a big beard and a machete standing in the corner and with the keys. Um, I'm a physician and I have zero accent, you know? So right there, people, when they see it in the media, whether it's fact or fiction, I feel like there's very little difference in media portrayal of women, both by what should be unbiased news and by storytellers. It's pretty much the same picture, which you see right here, the depiction of women in Islam. So we will talk about what the religion actually says. Next slide, please. Um, Okay, well, let me tell you, I kind of addressed the news media and Hollywood. If anybody remembers, I think by the time I graduated high school, certain books were being taught in school. When we were learning in classes about other religions, I think it was like Siddhartha that we had to read to learn about Hinduism, and Chosen when we had to read about Orthodox Judaism. But the book that was chosen to represent Islam, which I never actually got to study, but the kids kind of behind me, a generation behind me, learned, it was a book. I think it was Sheherbano or Gulbano. I might I think it was just Banu. And she was a child bride coming out of the country of Pakistan. And it's a fictional story, but it's obviously based on some truth. And so this is what was being taught as representative Islamic literature or Muslim literature, to introduce the religion of Islam to kids in school. So you can see where that would be a source of conflict, especially for teenagers who are already having identity issues. There's plenty of hate rhetoric. You can go on the internet and do an Islam search, and probably 30% of what you get is Islamophobic websites. And then the actions of Muslims themselves, even though less than 1% of, and it's way less than 1% of the entire world's Muslim population commits acts of terror, that's what people are going to remember, because people like me are not very memorable. We're very boring, and then we jar the the stereotypes that people do believe, and we force you to think and say, hey, maybe everything that I have heard and everything I have seen is not necessarily true. All right, next slide, and then we're ready to introduce what the Quran and the Sunnah, or Sharia law, actually says about women in the religion of Islam. Remember, oh, well, you won't remember because we didn't present this to you, but Getting to Know American Muslims and Their Faith, our Islam 101 course by the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, is it talks about the difference between religion and culture. And that's really hard for people to separate. And we would argue that many of the actions of Muslims, especially that less than 1% that we're talking about, when they're acting as a result of culture, and they're not acting upon the actual religion. Because surprisingly enough, a lot of the world's Muslim population doesn't practice the religion as it was sent down to them. They are executing the culture in which they grew up. And so hopefully we can bring more parts of that getting to know American Muslims and their faith to y'all so that we can describe the differences between religion and culture and why that happens a little bit more. All right, next slide. This is going to be kind of describing women and their rights in Islam. And so we'll be talking about their equal rights to men in both their nature and in, as human beings, what their responsibilities are as women of faith. That when we get into rights, we're talking about the right to education, right to employment, right to property, right to vote and participate in the political process. And then we talk about marriage, divorce, and custody, which are really big deals in Sharia law. You can go to the next slide, please. So, when we're talking about equal nature and humanity, these are verses out of the Quran that are specifically stating that women and men are created from one soul and they are equal. And like the rest of humanity that was created, the verse in the Quran is, "We've created you from many different tribes so that you may know each other." That's also the reason why genders were created, so that we could get to know each other. And there's no just because a man is born with a different anatomy doesn't make him closer to God or holier. Women can absolutely achieve as much holiness and as much piety through their acts of worship and through their belief in God as a man can. So there's no difference in that in Sharia law. All right, next slide, please. Shared responsibility. So, when I was a young girl and I hit puberty, I was told that the reason why we got our periods as women was because it was the punishment of Eve for the rest of time and the rest of womanhood to suffer the sins of Eve because she's the one that enticed God. So naturally, when I started reading the Quran in English as a teenager and I did not see that story of Eve enticing Adam in our scripture, I was like, that doesn't sound right. And then when I read the verses about uh, nobody is going to be punished for somebody else's sin, and I learned that, it was kind of like it shattered a lot of stereotypes for me, So it was very empowering to learn that in the Quran, both Adam and Eve are equally culpable and share responsibility for the fall from heaven because, like other traditions, Muslim tradition has the same story about falling from grace, and that's what happened. But it was actually Adam who asked for forgiveness, who had learned the words for forgiveness from God and asked. But there's no curse on womanhood. Womanhood is actually a huge blessing in Islam, and we'll talk about that in upcoming slide shortly. Next slide, please. Equal accountability. This kind of goes back to acts of worship. Both men and women are responsible for the acts of worship in Islam that they are required to do. And again, we hope to bring you that in a different lecture about the obligatory Muslim act of worship are, but both men and women are responsible to execute both because a woman is not going to be saved through the man's faith and a man is not going to be saved through her faith. They are each individually accountable to perform the acts of worship that are required to be a Muslim and that they will get equal credit. It's not like a man's worship is any better than a woman's worship, even though in some cases, when it comes to periods and postpartum bleeding, there are times when women are exempt from certain things, but that's not necessarily, that doesn't make their worship any less than, again. So, what I like is that second verse, whoever does right, male or female, is a believer. And this was really important back in pagan Arabia when there was idolatry and there was a lot of oppression of women, and women were considered inferior beings and actually forms of property. And there was a lot of trade going on between people, and women were being, that's where I guess, chattel comes from. So it was not specific to Islam. It was happening in pagan areas all over the world, all through time, and was actually still happening in other forms of religion before Islam ever came into the field. All right, next slide, please. Right to an education. So now that we're going into education, a lot of people believe that women are not educated in Islam. I'm not really sure where that stereotype comes from because, to be honest, even in the media and in Hollywood, I don't think I've necessarily gotten that. Maybe with some of the child bride situations, when those come to light, that's where that comes from. But actually, what when you see here in parentheses, it says prophetic saying, that is referring to the Sunnah or the Hadith, what Muhammad said and did, which is like integral to Sharia law. And what he said and is authenticated is that seeking knowledge is the duty of every believer. And the previous slides just showed you that, both men and women have the capacity and are competent enough to be true believers in Islam. So it is a duty upon both of them to seek knowledge. Like their Jewish counterparts, scholarship is really, really important to Muslims and they take it very seriously. Many famous Muslim scholars were actually women, jurists were women. The founder of the entire concept of universities and colleges is a woman. So that's why I had referred you guys to go back and research the origin of universities. Muslim women are students in many, many video for a quick second. So for those, if you didn't catch it, what I was saying is that Muslim women are participating in several different kinds of fields, science, math, politics, literature, basically everything you can think of. And it is not uncommon for a woman who looks like me to walk into a room and be a physician. So, actually, most of the women that I know with my cultural background, many, many of them are physicians. So, um, we can go on to the next slide. Basically, don't be surprised if a Muslim woman you meet is highly educated, especially in this country. So, right to a profession, again, women can choose what they want to go into. Now, there is a tradition of women going into fields that are considered social work, medicine, teaching, education. These are considered acts of social services. And so women will commonly pursue that, but there's no limitation to what women can do or what job they can have as long as it doesn't violate any Islamic principles. It seems we have a question, and I'm going to move my little screen over here so I can see that. Um, from Zeba. Thanks for participating, Zeba. If Islam gives women all these rights, why are Muslim families not following this? This kind of goes back to what the majority of Muslim families are doing. Many of them don't actually know what the Sharia law says about Islam, and I can speak personally on this as well. Many families are practicing culture. And this is not limited to Islam. This happens in many other religions as well, where women will religiously have many different rights, but they're not allowed to practice them given the cultural oppression, which has nothing to do many times with the religious oppression. And so that is the issue that we have. Uh, let's see. When we talk about right to a profession, Muhammad, the last prophet of Islam and the one that you hear about most in the media, happened to be married to the richest woman in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, which at the time was the pagan capital, pagan worship capital of the peninsula at the time. And so he married the richest woman who owned her own business and hired her own, uh, I want to say, agents to go conduct her business for her. Muhammad was actually one of her employees early on. So, the fact that women excelled in business and other fields is not limited to Islam. It actually happened very rarely, albeit, but did happen in pre-Islamic peninsular areas. And women will, again, excel in all fields today. You can open up many different apps and websites and news sources now and see a Muslim woman pretty much everywhere. I think when I usually end this entire presentation, I'm able to talk about how it seems in America that it's actually Muslim women right now who are bringing Islam to the forefront in the media and forcing a change of narrative by saying, you don't get to tell my story, I'm going to tell my story. Next slide, please. So financial rights. This is really cool because for those of us who loved English literature, like Jane Austen growing up, the laws of primogeniture were really confusing to us because we didn't understand why, the Bennet sisters had to marry a relative so that they wouldn't lose their family home, because as four daughters, they were not entitled to inherit their father's property. These laws were not changed until the early part of the 20th century in England and parts of Europe. In Islam, so 1400 years ago, women were born with the inherent right to not only earn their own money, but also to inherit from their fathers, from their mothers, from their family members, whatever was left to them. So the Quran specifically portions out in chapter 4, and I think there's a couple of other chapters. Again, not being a scholar, I can't tell you off the top of my head what those verses are, but you have one here from chapter 4, a short excerpt about the shares of men and women in inheritance laws in Sharia law. This is really, really important. But not only does she have the right to inherit, she has the right to earn her own money and keep it. So there is no obligation on her to contribute to the household expenditures. That money is for her to use if she wants to use it as toilet paper, if she wants to use it to go to the spa. She is not responsible for the household expenditures. If she gets married, then her husband is responsible for those and she can put all of her money into savings. Now, women a variety of different ways in actual practice. Some women do contribute to the household and some do not. So that's entirely on them. I did get a question one time about, well, isn't that oppressive that women are not required to sorry, I think I got us back on. I'm not sure why we keep losing video, but hopefully that will stop. Um, so one way that I made this really simple for my husband before we got married, just going to an anecdote about women and their money, is my husband, before we got married, we were in the courting process, wanted to know, well, how are we going to handle money? And I was like, well, we're going to do it Sharia law style. And he was like, what is that? And he really, truly, poor kid, didn't know. So I told him, your money is my money and my money is my money. And that's how it's been. And we're going on 14 years and we're doing just fine. Next slide, please. So, public affairs and politics. Over 1400 years ago, women were given the right to vote. They played an important role in that. Now, we do have certain Muslim countries that are rolling out women's right to vote now. Please know that that's a cultural phenomenon and not a religious phenomenon because these same countries are very big strict sticklers about sticking to Sharia law, except when it comes to giving women their rights. So, we know who those major players are. Um, Women did not have to go through a male counterpart. The most important political action at the time of Muhammad was to convert to Islam. And so women would come, and at a time there was a huge population of women that came to convert en masse, and that was the Pledge of Allegiance of the women. So they pledged their loyalty to Islam and to Muhammad, and they said that, we would like to be Muslim. And he took them at their word. They did not need any male representatives to declare their faith. They were independent, free thinking, competent women. And we have the Caliph Umar here quoted as, Islam gives a woman full rights as a reasonable human being. She's not considered any lesser. She's not obtunded because of her sex. We don't have any words like hysteria, which comes from, in Latin, it goes on to, it's associated with women because the uterus, what happens when you get a uterus taken out? It's a hysterectomy. So you remove your hysteria, and that is the source of hysteria because you happen to be born with the uterus. Well, Islam doesn't have that concept. And in fact, the uterus in the Arabic language is called rahma, which means mercy. And one of the things that Muslims call God and believe that one of his names is the most merciful, and he is the one that is most full of mercy. But who did he give it to physically? Put it inside of women. So I always think that that's really cool. And I, if anything, am an androgynist. I try really hard to remember that men are equal to me. All right, and not any lesser. Next slide, please. So, equal treatment, this is where I can see where a lot of Muslim girls, myself included, grew up feeling like women were inferior because there is a cultural in the majority of the Muslim world, which comes from the Indian subcontinent, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, make up the largest population of Muslims on the planet. There is significant misogyny, and that is a cultural phenomenon that comes from other non Muslim cultures where women and women children, female children, are considered lesser. However, in Islam, um, it's very strongly preferred to have girls and to treat them well. This was also a phenomenon that came, or a result of the phenomenon of female infanticide that was happening in pre-Islamic Arabia, where a female child was considered a curse, so they were literally buried alive in the sand. So Islam comes and Muhammad comes, and his only surviving children out of the many children he had are his four daughters. And he was teaching people. There are a couple of different versions of the second one that you see. Whoever has three daughters and treats them kindly will be a protection for him against the fire, meaning the daughters will be a protection for him in the fire. I've actually heard this as also with two daughters. My poor husband only has one, so of course he feels a little left out of that. But we don't know. Again, if God is the most merciful, and because Muslims believe that, hopefully he has nothing to worry about. Um, what are some of the things, we have a question, what are some of the things that Muslims can do to combat the cultural phenomenon of keeping women down, meaning the persistent oppression of women and particularly female children? I think it's educating ourselves and especially our daughters about what their rights are from the get-go. For those people who are not married, I suggest that you learn women's rights in Islam before you go trying to you're a man to a if you're a woman before you allow anybody to pursue or court you. It's going to be really important that that person has a very strong understanding of where your place is in Islam so that when you turn around after marriage and say, our female children are going to do what our male children do, they're not going to be very surprised. So, thank you for that question. Um, when I was signing up my daughter for extracurricular activities, our sons played soccer, and my husband's like, "Well, are we going to sign her up for gymnastics and ballet?" And I thought, "What? Why would I do that?" And he's like, "Well, isn't that what girls do?" Now, he's an only child, bless his heart, so he had no idea. And I explained to him, I was like, "No, she's going to play soccer like her brothers." And as it turned out, she hated soccer, and when she grew up, she signed up for dance and ballet. So there you go. But the fact is that a son is no more desirable in Islam per Sharia law than a daughter is. They are both really, really important and a means for parents to get to paradise if they raise them properly. Um, that is not to say that the cultural baggage of sons being preferred over daughters does not continue in many parts of the Muslim world, and I would say arguably even in American Muslim households right now. So that is, that is a nod to this last question that we had. How do we decrease that? I think it's by talking more and more and more about how important our daughters are, how important our women are. This whole concept of carrying on names. My favorite thing to throw back to people who don't have sons is people know about Muhammad not just through his followers, but his lineage was carried on by his daughter. Hassan and Hussein were his grandsons through his daughter Fatima, and that's how his name was carried, his bloodline was carried on. And so I remind people who say, like, I really want a son so that I can pass on my name. I think that's BS. My last name is the same name as my father because I did not change my last name. And we will talk about why that is in upcoming slides. Next slide, please. Marriage, and there it is. So this is an authentic saying of Muhammad. So from the Sunnah or Sharia law again, is that marriage is half of somebody's faith. So that's why there is this very strong emphasis of getting married in the religion of Islam. In Islam, it's great if it's romantic and everybody falls in love and it's like the movies and Sleepless in Seattle and all that stuff. I've dated myself by saying that. Marriage in Islam, while it can be romantic, is not necessarily. It is an actual contract that must be filled out. So, a written document that states that these are the two parties that are coming together. Contracts are really, really important in Islamic law. You can go to hell for breaking a contract, for violating a contract. So, that's why even marriage, which is such an important part of an uh, an act of community, really. The contract is super important. Part of what's written out in the contract is the meher, or the gift of the bridegroom to the bride. So, in other cultures, non Muslim cultures, there's going to be this pressure on the bride and her family to kind of pay off the groom and give him a bunch of money. But in Islam, it's the opposite. The meher is his gift. A woman has a right to this upon her marriage, and, it's based on what a man earns. So if he's super rich, he's not going to give her a penny. If he's super poor, he's not going to give her a Porsche. So, it's based on what he can afford. And the idea is that, this is kind of like your mad money, so your spa money. So if you decide you don't ever want to work, because there's no obligation on you to work, if you want to, then you may. Then please go spend this however you want. It's a source of financial security for the woman to hang on to. She can invest it, she can do whatever she wants to. Um, Women, well, I'll go back to the story about the meher in a second. Consenting adults, both men and women, must consent to a marriage. And in Islamic law, actually, the imam or the spiritual leader is going to be going to the woman first to ask her consent before he goes back to the congregation and the bridegroom and gets his consent for the marriage, because she must be surrounded by no people from her family on her own. She's not under any kind of physical or emotional duress when she makes this decision. Arranged marriage is a cultural practice that doesn't just happen in Islam. It happens in many non-Muslim cultures, especially in a lot of non-Muslim cultures. But I speak to that a little bit as well. What I like and I enjoy, and what I ended up showing my dad sometime when I was in college, is the last prophetic saying from Sharia law there is that parents do not force their daughters. A woman has a right to choose. Um, so going back to the meher real quick, when my husband and I discussed marriage and we were courting, there was a certain amount of the meher that I told him I wanted. When it came time for our actual marriage contract to be signed and executed and our marriage ceremony to happen, which happened in the masjid on a Friday, the Muslim house of worship with 300 some odd people there, because Friday is the congregational prayer. So there was people I knew and many, many people I didn't know over there. So the imam is coming to me to ask me if I give my permission to marry so and so, son of so and so, for this amount. And I was like, hold on, that's not the right amount. It was like 50% of what I had written or what I had agreed with my husband. So, my fiance. And, so the imam got kind of nervous. I was like, well, what do you want me to do? I was like, hold on. So I closed the door because I'm in a separate room. I closed the door and I'm like, asking my best friend, what do I do? And she's like, just sign it. You'll figure it out. Don't worry. Like, don't stop basically, this is holding up the wedding now. Like, the wedding ceremony is not happening because Uzma's not wanting to sign the contract. So I opened the door. I was like, okay, I'll sign it. And so we were in the Muslim house of worship. We were on separate sides, like the women and the men's side. So when we finally meet outside, and my husband wants to, hug me for the first time as a couple, I'm like, hold up. Who changed the contract? Where's the rest of my meher? And he was like, I didn't change the contract. And we separate, whatever, because we have to go get ready for our party that night. And I'm fuming with my family, like, I can't believe he changed the contract. And I'm so mad at him. And blah, 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 blah. And my dad's like, no, no, no. He didn't change the contract. I changed the contract. And I was like, why did you change it? And he was like, my sister had gotten married 2 months before I did. And he said, I let your sister go for this much, and this is what she got. And if you went for more, then she might feel bad. And I didn't want her to think that there was any inequity in how I was giving away my daughters to these men. So it was because my dad wanted to be very just, and wanted to show, us as his children that we were the same to him as his daughters. And so that's a father's love. When it comes to arranged marriage, I myself did have an arranged marriage where, we courted, we got to know each other, and then, my dad asked me what I wanted to do, and I said, yeah, this is the way I would like to pursue it. So arranged marriages can work. There's actually a really terrible show on TV about arranged marriages. It's called well, I'm not going to say the name because I don't want any litigation, but you meet your spouse at the altar, which I think is terrible because there are certain discussions that you need to have. And Islam promotes that you should ask and you should actually court in a permissible manner. Freely dating without the intention of getting married in the end is not going to be allowed. That goes kind of to the section of this entire presentation, which is gender relations, and that is not going to be discussed today because it's outside the scope of this. So, next slide, please. Marital rights. Women have the rights to a happy marriage, to financial support, to shared responsibility of the housework because they are not the cookers and the cleaners. I know that that happens, but guess what? That happens in all cultures and all religions all over the planet, where a woman can be a professional, but at home she starts her second job as soon as she enters the door. But what's number two I skipped over is keep her maiden name. So a lot of people don't know that in Islam, actually, a woman's supposed to keep her last name. And this is kind of going back to the tribal identity so that you're known by, your dad and that lineage. This is important because of the laws of inheritance. You need to know who your father is so that you can inherit from whomever that is. And that's going to be important on both paternal and maternal sides. So this was also a source of conflict before I got married because my husband was like, well, are you going to start the paperwork to change your name? And I was like, no, because Sharia law says I keep my name and I'm not your house or your car. You don't get to, you know, the marriage contract is not your title to me. And he was like, well, that's what everybody does. And I was like, that may be what everybody does, but I was born my daddy's daughter and I'm going to die my daddy's daughter. But you, I can change anytime. And that did not sit well with him, but he still married me. So it worked out. And we'll talk about divorce, I believe, on the next slide. Oh, yes, family rights. So again, going back to good treatment, there is this concept that Muslim men beat their wives, and there is no statistic out there that says any one culture, religion, or ethnicity has a monopoly on domestic violence. It happens to women all the time in every culture, and in America in particular, there are stats out there, none of which prove that Muslim men have a propensity to violence within the home than any other man in America. That is absolutely not true. There are particular groups where you can find it. So, but it's not going to be in Muslim households. Um, Women have the right to seek a divorce. So even though divorce is not very well liked in Islam, it is absolutely permissible, and a woman can ask for divorces, and in that case, she will get custody of the young children. So the only time that I heard Sharia law growing up as a kid, pre 9/11, was when at that time I only knew immigrant Muslim families, and so these immigrant Muslim women a lot of times wouldn't speak English, wouldn't be working, and their husbands, for whatever reason, X, Y, or Z, would decide to leave them. They would take all the money and they would take the kids. So these women are now left destitute and they don't have their biggest treasure, which is their children. And so the whole community would kind of band together to try to help her execute her Sharia law rights, which is continued financial protection in the event of a divorce. And that's food, clothing, and shelter, especially if the man is divorcing her, and then the right to custody of the children. But American family law is very different and doesn't honor the Sharia law. In many, many of these cases, and many of the times that I saw it growing up, the women lost all financial and physical custody of their children because Sharia law does not exist in America, much to the which is the opposite of what a lot of Islamophobes in America say, because there's creeping Sharia, right? But when I showed these slides in college classrooms and in communities, they're like, well, that doesn't sound bad. And I'm like, all of this is Sharia law, y'all. So if you have a problem with any of the things that I said today, or if you liked what I said, then you're liking Sharia law. All right, next slide, please. Rights of mothers. This is really important to me, not just because I am a mother, but because I'm a daughter as well. So, mothers are super duper important in Islam. Both parents are to be honored in Islam, but especially the mother. There is a saying of Muhammad that paradise lies beneath the mother of your feet. What I like is a story, an authentic story of one of the companions of Muhammad coming to him and saying, asking who amongst my companions deserves the best of my companionship? Who should I show the manners to, basically? Or who should I be the nicest to? Muhammad answered, your mother. And the gentleman said, okay, then who? And Muhammad answered, your mother. And the gentleman was like, okay, then who? And Muhammad answered, your mother. And then for the fourth time, the man asked, okay, then who? And he said, your father. So, anytime we're talking about my kids want something from me, they'll come from us, they will come and ask me first. And I'm like, go ask your dad. And they'll be like, no, your mother, your mother, your mother, and then your father. So you got to say no 3 times before we'll go take it. And typically, like I've already lost it at the second time. Like, all right, fine. Have your electronics, don't care. The other story that I really love is when a companion performed the Muslim spiritual act of performing the Hajj. At the time, during Muhammad's lifetime, there was no transportation, right? So people did it on foot. He carried his old mother on his back. This is 10 days of really physical, hard labor, y'all. So he came back to Muhammad and he said, I performed the entire Hajj carrying my mother on my back. Did I fulfill my obligation to her? Like, am I done? Is it even Stevens now, basically? And Muhammad said, you haven't repaid her for one of the pains of one of her contractions that she had. So I love it. Of course, I'm biased because I have 4 children and I will hold that over for them for the rest of eternity. But when we're talking about the naggart moms and the fishwife moms and, people complaining about their moms, as Muslims or Muslim Americans, some of us find it very hilarious because we're like, yeah, the right of our mother is so great upon us that we can't even, complain when she's telling us 10,001 times, have more kids or get married or, whatever, put on your makeup or fix your clothes, all that kind of stuff. So I believe that's our last slide. And we are open for any other questions. If anybody has them, I believe they'll pop up on the bottom of the screen here. If not, we've gone a little bit over time. I appreciate everyone tolerating the issues in connectivity today with the video. Thank you so much for holding on. There is a question here. What can we do to break the stereotypes created about Muslim women? So I think this is a great question for both Muslims and non-Muslims um, to ask. Because if you're a non-Muslim tuning in today, what can you do to break the stereotypes? I think one very easy thing you can do is refer people to come to more of the Bureau of Arizona Social Distancing session, and these videos are going to be posted up on our Facebook page, so people can just log in and they can see it again, and they can see a talking Muslim head who happens to be female, who happens to be a Muslim woman, and hopefully some of those stereotypes can break for them in their minds. As a Muslim, I think some of the things that we can do is put our best foot forwards, our best feet forward. I can do that. I can make subjects and verbs agree, and live good examples. And I think that's going to be really, really important because, when I walk into a patient room, Sometime, well, when I used to walk into a patient room, there used to be a lot of surprise, like, when's the doctor coming? Oh, I am the doctor. And that I thought was really, really helpful because, I could kind of the onion layers coming off. I feel like Shrek. Yeah, the onion layers were coming off, and people were starting to get a better understanding. And then as I developed that patient-doctor relationship, um, they would learn a little bit more about me. Obviously, I'm there just to learn about them. But I think if we all just put our best feet forward as Muslims in Islam, as women in Islam, and not with a chip on our shoulder, like we have something to prove, but just to live our lives in the best way as the best examples of Islam, that in itself incites a lot of questions and a lot of curiosity from people. And sometimes they're going to be very hesitant to ask. And I think it's really important to have an open mind when those questions come. I used to be very defensive when people ask me why I wore my hijab. Now I understand that most of the time those questions are coming from a place of true curiosity. Answer those. For those people who do not look visibly Muslim, I think it's also important not to get offended if people ask, why don't you cover? I think it's really important to be honest about what your answer is, so that we can invite more questions, invite that curiosity, invite that feeling of I have a neighbor and I want to get to know my neighbors better. So I think that addresses both non-Muslim and non-Muslim populations asking those questions. I so appreciate everybody being here on behalf of the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona. We are really excited to continue bringing great programming to you through our social distancing learning initiative every Tuesday and Thursday at 11 a.m. Please join us for Facebook Lives, and we'll be doing that for however long we need to do it until we can come back out to you in person. Thanks so much, everybody. Shalom, salam, and peace.